from lunch, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome Mark Heywood with us today. Just a brief introduction. Mark Heywood is the Executive Director of Section 27. Section 27 was established in May 2010. It incorporates the AIDS Law Project, ALP, one of South Africa's most successful post-apartheid human rights organizations. Section 27 is a public interest law center that seeks to influence, develop, and use the law to protect, promote, and advance human rights. Mr. Heywood grew up in Nigeria, Ghana, Botswana, and England. He holds an MA honors in English language and literature from Balliol College, Oxford University. After graduating from Oxford in 1986, he worked for the Marxist Workers' Tendency, the ANC, first in London and then from 1989 to 1994 in South Africa. During this time, he was instrumental in setting up campaigns such as the Philemon Mwepu Defense Campaign, the Leo Cobb Political Prisoners Support Committee, and the Johannesburg Inner City Community Forum. He also did an MA in African Literature at the University of Witwatersrand, Johannesburg, and lectured and wrote on the influence of Shakespeare in African writing. I'm curious to hear more about that. And politics in South Africa. Mr. Heywood has written extensively on HIV, human rights, and the law, including co-editing the AIDS in the Law Resource Manual and Health and Democracy, a guide to human rights, health law, and policy in post-apartheid South Africa. He's been part of the legal team of the ALP and TAC that have been involved in all the major litigation around HIV and human rights. So it is our great honor to welcome you to our fellowship.
Thank you very much for such a warm welcome, and apologies for such a long thing to read out. I apologize for that. I should also introduce quickly Shari. Shari has the misfortune of job shadowing me for 3 days. She's a student at Sacred Heart College and is interested in social justice and human rights work, which is she's come to Section 27 for a few days. I also want to apologize for coming a few minutes late. I think, as you all know, we are in the middle of a constitutional and political crisis in this country, and I am quite deeply involved in working with a range of people from churches, from other civil society organizations, from the trade unions, from the artistic community, the arts sector, in trying to catalyze a new civil society public response to call on President Zuma to resign as the president of South Africa. And we're starting that movement in about 1 hour and 20 minutes with the press conference that we're holding outside the Constitutional Court this afternoon. And that press conference is going to be addressed by a very unusual group of South African leaders, people who want to be seen to be people of high moral standing, people who nobody can criticize. And it will include the Archbishop of Cape Town, Thabo Makgoba, the former chairperson of Nedbank, Raul Khoza, Cheryl Carolus, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, the former Secretary General of the ANC and one of the leaders of the United Democratic Front during the 1980s, which really was responsible for bringing about the end of apartheid and the mass uprising in our country in the 1980s, and a range of other people. And the message that we're going to be sending this afternoon is that now is the time when citizens who are concerned about our democracy, not just concerned, but believe in our democracy, and who believe in the vision of our Constitution, which is a vision of constantly narrowing inequality and rising dignity for the people of this country, that if ever there was a time, now is the time to stand up and to make your voices heard. So we will be announcing that we're calling on people across the country to engage in discussions. In particular, on April the 16th, we're going to call a national consultative meeting in Regina Mundi Church in Soweto, probably. That's a week on Saturday. And the dream we have is that on April the 27th, of course, Freedom Day, we will hold mass demonstrations across the country to call on the president to step down and to say that this is not the South Africa that we want. We want a South Africa that gives people dignity and equality and opportunity and that doesn't tolerate corruption. That's the South Africa that we want. But we will never get that South Africa unless we take our responsibilities as citizens seriously. Our responsibilities to other people, our responsibilities to the constitution of our country, and our responsibilities to our future. And I guess I wasn't asked to come here and speak about what's happening in an hour's time. I was asked to come and speak about the treatment action campaign and how we built the treatment action campaign, which is what I'll do now for the next 10 or 15 minutes. And then I'll leave 15 minutes because I think our interaction is as important as you listening to a talking head. But I will have to leave by 2:20 just to go to the Constitutional Court. So, the first thing I want to say is that we have, probably the best constitution in the world. I think one thing we should see as sort of the high watermark of the struggle for equality and liberation in this country is what is contained in the South African constitution. Many people are critical of the constitution. Some people say it was a compromise, it was a sellout, it meant that we didn't actually have a revolution. But those of us who were involved in those days know that the political compromise in 1994 was a way of staving off a destructive racial civil war that would have been very difficult to rebuild a country, whoever won. And frankly, nobody would have won because it would have involved enormous bloodshed and loss of life and destruction in the country. But the people who say, that we sold out also fail to look at what this requires of our government and what it requires of us as the people of this country. It's the supreme law of this country, which, as you saw last week with the judgment of the Constitutional Court in Heywood, means that nobody is higher than this. The president is not higher than this, no political party, no religion, no chief, no individual. This lays down the law of the country. And if you look at what the law of the country says, the supreme law of the country says, it says that our government has to constantly be working to narrow inequalities in the country. It dictates our economic policy in some ways. It certainly dictates our political policy. It says, for example, and I'll touch briefly on this in a few minutes, that children have a right to a quality basic education. It doesn't say that we should just give kids schools that don't have books or don't have toilets or don't have teachers. The language of the Constitution is very clear that kids have a right to a quality education immediately, and that the government must do everything within its powers to provide that quality education. So the education system that we have, and I'm not sure whether you came from public schools or private schools or both, and if you know, many of you will know what public schools are like, is an unlawful situation. It's against the law. It's against the law that schools don't have textbooks, or it's against the law that 80,000 kids in Limpopo go to schools where there's still no toilets. It's against the law that, I toured the toilets of schools in Limpopo, and they're filthy and they're disgusting and they're degrading, and you can't think or learn if you think, when I go to the toilet, I can't go to the toilet, I'm going to have to endure a horrible smell that sticks to my clothes or whatever. That's an unlawful situation. But the thing with the Constitution that it's important to understand, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to have to, from time to time, check there's no urgent things. We're just finishing a press statement for this afternoon. The thing about the Constitution is that it's not self-enacting. Okay? It's a piece of paper. And pieces of paper, you can scrunch them up. This does nothing by itself. It depends upon citizen agency to turn this into a reality. It depends on our engagement with government at every level to get government to do what is required in here. Now, it's not that government is resistant to doing this. There's many great people in government, and I know many of them, but there's also some bad people in government. But also government is always contested. So you get big business people who will say, well, government should do this. Build us big roads so that we have an economy that can transport goods and we can bring investment. And they have a lot of power, whereas the people will say, build us good schools, or make sure our clinics have medicines. So the people have to exert their power. And the thing about the Constitution is that it gives us a lot of power. So it gives us rights to freedom of expression, it gives us rights to demonstration, rights to pickets, rights of access to information. It gives us an enormous amount of power. And it creates something quite unique in South Africa, which is a participatory democracy. So ours is not a democracy where you vote every 5 years and then there's nothing you can do. It's a democracy where you vote, but where there's then an opportunity that you engage, that you check, that you watch, etc. And if you use those, and so when you get to, I've forgotten what section it is, I think it's section 18 of the Constitution, you'll see section 19, when it talks about political rights. It doesn't just talk about rights to form a political party. It also says every citizen has a right to campaign for a political party or cause. You have a right to campaign for a cause. So when people like us stand up and say we want quality education, we're not being anti-government. We're being pro-constitution. We're campaigning for a cause. And as I think all of you know, without a quality education, you're stuck. You are very, very, very stuck. I mean, today the research shows that even if you get a matric, unless you've got a matric that allows you to go to university, a plain old matric pass is not going to get you a job anymore. So the quality of the education that you get will determine the course of your life. That's the fact of the matter. So if you're denied a quality education, sorry, it's not just about your experience between the age of 6 and 18. It's going to be about your experience between the age of 6 and 60, which is the average life expectancy in our country. So, we took advantage of this Constitution. The Treatment Action Campaign was one of the first organizations to take advantage of the Constitution. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we did. Way back in the 1990s, people didn't really realize what a threat the HIV epidemic presented to South Africa. There was a lot of stigma. HIV is a long period where HIV is in the body, but it doesn't actually cause illness before it starts to break down the immune system. But we knew what was happening with the HIV epidemic because we were involved, we were health activists. And by the late 1990s, we also knew that there had been breakthroughs in the treatment of HIV in developed countries, in America and places, that had changed HIV from a condition that would always cause death, or almost always cause death, to a condition that is a chronic disease. So as long as you take the medicines, then you can live with HIV. And you can live as long as a person who doesn't have HIV, with HIV. But the problem for us in the late 1990s was, whilst people in America had access to the medicines, people in poor countries didn't have access to the medicines. So at the very same moment as in America death was beginning to slow down, our death was beginning to speed up dramatically in the late 1990s and into the early 2000s. So a group of us, which numbered to begin with about 10, decided in late 1998, okay, we've got to change this. We've got to try to make sure that people in this country have equal access to what are called antiretroviral medicines. So we formed the Treatment Action Campaign on Human Rights Day of 1998, International Human Rights Day, December the 10th, 1998. And we announced that we were going to campaign for access to these medicines. And in particular, we said, okay, we're just citizens, but we're going to use this thing. We're going to use it to legitimate our demands, and if necessary, we're going to use it to go to the courts in the same way that the EFF went to the courts on the public protector issue. We will go to the courts and say to the courts, is there a duty on the government to make sure that the public health system provides people with access to medicines? We were 10 people. Over the next 4 or 5 years, we built a movement mostly made up of people living with HIV. That's why we produced this T-shirt, because we wanted to break the stigma around HIV. But we also said, we need people who know what it's like to have HIV, to lead this struggle. Because if you have HIV, it's a matter of life and death, whether you succeed with this particular struggle. And our friends were dying, and so on and so on. But we built a movement of about 35,000 people, mostly women, mostly poor people, overwhelmingly poor people, mostly people living with HIV. The way we built that movement was we went to communities and we made people aware of their rights. But we also went to communities and we taught people about HIV. Because if you don't understand an issue, you can't campaign for it. So if you don't understand HIV, how do you get infected? What does HIV do to your body? What sort of treatments work? How do the treatments work? How much do the treatments cost? What's the medicines called, etc., etc.? Then you can't campaign. Activism isn't just about noise. It's not just about toy, although noise and toy is very important. Activism is also about informed citizens campaigning for their rights. So we started to build that movement. We encountered something that we didn't expect to encounter, which I don't have time to talk about today, which was what we all now call AIDS denialism. President Mbeki, for some reason that still we don't really understand, decided that the suggestion that HIV was a virus was a conspiracy, and it's not true that there's such a thing called HIV. And then he decided that the medicines that treat HIV are poisonous and that we shouldn't provide those medicines to people living with HIV. And so for 5 years, from the point when there was a breakthrough in the medical science, our country, our government refused to provide those medicines. We went to court in 2001 over a very simple medical intervention, not treatment for people with AIDS for their benefit, but we went over a very simple medical intervention for women who had HIV, who were pregnant. Because in those days, if you were a woman and you had HIV, the risk of passing HIV to the baby was in the region of 35%. So 35% of women who lived with HIV would transmit HIV to the child, and the child would always die within 1 or 2 years in most instances. But the way medically it was possible to massively reduce that simply by giving the mother 1 pill when she went into labor, and the mother and child syrup and a pill after the baby was born. the way the science work is simply that these drugs do, they're called antiretrovirals, is they drop the level of virus very quickly. And the person's infectivity relates to the volume of virus in their body. So if you can quickly suppress the level of virus, then the chances of the baby being born without HIV are very much smaller. So it was a simple medical intervention, but Thabo Mbeki and the government were saying, we're not giving it to people because it's poison. So we went to the Constitutional Court in 2001, to the courts in 2001. Eventually, we won in the Constitutional Court in July of 2002, and the Constitutional Court, a bit like it did with Nkandla a few days ago, ordered the government to roll out a program to provide this medical intervention to pregnant women who had HIV. And as a result of that, today, the rate of mother-to-child HIV transmission, the rate at which a mother infects the child, is less than 2%. So whereas in those days, 70,000 kids were being born per year with HIV and dying, now we are down to about less than 5,000 children being born per year. And that was the power of social mobilization and activism and using the law. We continued our campaigns, and I'm happy to send, because time is so short, but if you're interested, to send some articles I've written about the work of the Treatment Action Campaign over the years. But we also, of course, faced two other fronts of resistance. One was Thabo Mbeki, who said, we're not giving treatment to people with HIV, even though treatment saved people's lives. And the other was the pharmaceutical companies who charged hugely exorbitant prices for these medicines. When we started our campaigns, the cost for a month of the medicines was about 6,000 rand a month. And the pharmaceutical companies said to us, okay, we'll reduce the prices of these medicines to 4,000 rand, but we can't go any lower than 4,000 rand a month. So we did our research. We joined up with activists in other parts of the world, and we were able to show that in fact the cost of the medicines was a few hundred rand at most, the actual production costs. So again, we went to the courts, and we said to the courts, look, people have got a right to health in here. People have got a right to life. Now, pharmaceutical companies may have what they call intellectual property rights, but those are administrative legal devices. It's not that an intellectual pharmaceutical company has a right like me to dignity or health. Those are a different type of rights. And we said, look, they are using their intellectual property rights to make massive profits. And the price of the profits is the death of many hundreds of thousands of people. And again, the courts agreed with us. So we were able to bring the price of medicines down from that 6,000 rand a month to the price now of about 100 rand per month of those very same drugs. And that 100 rand per month is today keeping 3.5 million people in this country alive, because there are now 3.5 million people in South Africa who on a daily basis are taking these medicines to control HIV in their blood and in their bodies. So, the bottom line is that whereas in the year 1998, when we started the campaign, there was not one person receiving antiretroviral treatment, and whereas we fought until early 2004 to get the government to start providing to a few hundred people, we've now got 3.5 million people who are on access to treatment, and the target for the country is 6.5 million people, because there's 6.5 million people who live with HIV in South Africa. So I want to conclude by saying, that is the power of the Constitution. That is the power of human agency. That's your power. It's not my power. I just did it with a group of other people. It's the power that you have to effect social change in this country. And, the issue for you as young leaders is that if you don't start to exercise that power, then the country that you grow up in and grow older in is going to be a very nasty place. And the world is going to be a very nasty place. Because if you don't exercise your power on issues such as environmental degradation, climate change, water security, youth quality of education, challenge the extremely high levels of unemployment in this country. Unemployment amongst people your age is 60% in this country. Then the country is going to tear itself apart at a certain point. So whereas, when I grew up and finished university, in some ways, there was a bit of a choice about whether you decided to go into a life where you became a human rights activist and a political activist. And some of us did. Some of my peers went on to become big business people and the mayor of London and so on. I think that these days you don't really have a choice, which doesn't mean that you have to become 24 hours, 7 days a week activists, but it does mean that you've got to start to take some responsibility for the country and the world, and you've got to know that you've got power and you have a right to do that. So let me stop there. I've spoken for longer, but I've filled it for 15 minutes, but I'm going to be a little bit rude just for 2 seconds. While you start the question, just to make sure I haven't got any urgent messages saying the press conference is off or something like that. So thank you very much.
Do you want to take them one at a time?
Yes, or no, I'll take a few at a time and then...
So,
Thank you. It's me.
yes, sir. And then you did Sonella, and then Zima, and then Mohammed. And then, yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Abu Bakr. I want to ask you regarding the Constitution. You said no one is above the Constitution. And as far as I'm concerned, I think that Jacob Zuma has proved that he's above the Constitution. The reason being, if they failed to remove him with immediate effect, then it wasn't applicable. He had violated the Constitution. And my question is, don't you think that it's convenience for you guys to mobilize? I'm anti-Zuma, don't get twisted. Yeah.
Speak free.
Don't you think that it's convenient? It's only convenience for you guys to mobilize the masses just to remove Zuma? Because if that Constitution had that power, or if none of us was above the Constitution, I think that Jacob Zuma couldn't have that leverage of maybe distorting or sabotaging the Constitution. My question. I think that's my question.
My question is more related on HIV and AIDS education in our curriculum. Because it goes without saying that, especially in our life orientation curriculum, where children are taught about HIV and AIDS. So I think it goes without question that it's lacking, because the only thing that kids actually learn is the acronym, essentially, what HIV stands for and what AIDS stands for and how to avoid it, basically. There's an absence of a compassionate type of education, which is then instrumental in eradicating stigmas and stereotypes. So how do you think we can actually go about creating radical transformation in terms of education? Because a lot of South Africans are living with HIV.
Yeah.
So then it is essential, if you're talking about transformation, you're talking about constitutional rights, then surely that should be part of our agenda as how we can destigmatize and eradicate stereotypes about HIV education.
Can I take those two
Yes,
first?
yes, however you want.
Just quickly. Abu Bakr, the issue is that nobody is above the law. Jacob Zuma conducts himself as if he's above the law. And Jacob Zuma and other senior members of the ANC don't understand the Constitution. That's one of the problems. They don't. It sounds terrible to say that, but it's true. They didn't realise, what they were adopting back in 1996. Some people realised, Nelson Mandela, etc., realised, but others didn't. And so we have to educate, not just the ANC, but any political party, any government leader, representative, what is the Constitution and what does it create? We created the Constitution, and it does a fine balancing act because we have a country where the majority rule, that's the electoral system, but where we've written a Constitution that doesn't allow the majority to abuse minorities, whatever type of minority, and says that even if you have a majority government, it doesn't mean that it can just discount the feelings of other political parties, the feelings of minorities, etc. Now, the issue with Jacob Zuma is not about an individual. It's not a personal thing about Jacob Zuma. It's about his conduct as the president. And when we say Jacob Zuma must resign, it's not about that the struggle ends with Jacob Zuma must resign. Actually, we need Jacob Zuma to resign in order to begin to build a country along the lines envisaged by the Constitution. But whilst we have Jacob Zuma as the president, and Jacob Zuma is protecting lots of other corrupt people around him, then, for example, billions of rands that should be going into the education system or should be going into the health system are going into people's pockets, going into other people's pockets. So, and the other thing is that if you have a corrupt president, it sends a signal to many other people that it's okay to be corrupt. And now this president has gone so far that we have no option than to say resign. We won't easily say to anybody resign from any position. But this president has done so much wrong that if we are going to start correcting this country, we have to get another president. But when we get another president, we have to watch carefully. We can't just say, okay, we trust you. Because remember, some of the people I'm working with now, as well as the Zimbabwean people, they put this guy there. They trusted him. And it's not that you don't trust politicians, but you have to understand that they're there to serve us, and so we have to keep an eye on them all of the time. So it's not opportunistic to mobilize against Jacob Zuma. It's about breaking one of the barriers to putting this country back onto a good grounds. And in some ways it relates, you didn't say your name, to Ditswanelo's question. There's so much we know. What frustrates me as an activist is our problems are not often due to lack of knowledge. They're to do with failure to implement, for whatever reason we fail to implement, and to do with a lack of courage. So let me tell you what we know. We know with HIV that most new HIV infections take place in young girls between the ages of 14 and 20. That's the highest rate of new HIV infections. We know from research that those girls are not being infected by boys in school, but are often being infected by their older men, for whatever, I don't have time to go into it. So if the only thing we did was to say we're going to have a serious focus on schools and sex education and sexuality education and so on, and we were serious about it, we could break that. we could start to reduce the number of HIV infections in young girls. But that requires that we challenge gender inequalities in schools, which a male-dominated world doesn't want to do or talk about. It requires that we talk about sexuality and sex in schools, and that we admit that people, not all people, but many people, will start having sex or experimenting with sex at the age of 14 or 15 or whatever. We know that, come on, we all know that. We know we've got high teenage pregnancy in public schools. That means people are having sex. That we address those issues squarely. And it also means that we run our schools better, and that we, as you were saying, that we invest in education. Because a lot of youngsters are falling out of the education system before they even get to matric. 50% of learners fall out of education between grade 10 and grade 12. Most of those are girls. Once a girl's out of the education system, she becomes even more vulnerable to risks such as HIV infection. So we know what to do. When are we going to do it? But again, the question is, if it's left to Mark Heywood and Section 27 and a few people to say we should be dealing with these issues, we don't deal with them. If lots of people start to say we should be dealing with these issues, they will be dealt with.
Thank you. So we have 7 minutes and three more questions. So brevity. Okay, Zima, I think is.
Okay, I'd like to know how are these pharmaceutical companies using patents right now? Because I just said they're using patents against the rollout of ARVs.
Yeah.
And how far are we in terms of research into finding a cure and also using traditional medicine in the fight against HIV and AIDS?
I just wanted to ask, how significantly did the death rate change from the time that the antiretrovirus, whatever medication was denied, and currently now to this time at the moment, and mainly from the people who have not maybe reported they have not engaged in the medication itself. So how's the death rate changing?
And then a couple more, or is it for these two?
Sure.
Okay. So, Marcelo?
Okay, thank you. For me, I just want to know, like, from you as an individual who's fighting for the rights of people, and which implies that you have to be against some of the politically influential people in South Africa, like Thabo Mbeki and now Zuma. How risky is your life like? Because putting your life on the line for, which is a very good thing, but for us as emerging leaders, how do we maneuver around that space? Because like a couple of hours ago, we have seen stats that people are dying. Even though we're not afraid of death, but we would like to know from someone who's been in the sphere for long, like how do you deal with that, you know? Because actually I'm scared.
So am I.
Given time constraints, is it okay if I close? Oh, sorry, Patrick has one more.
Yeah.
Last question.
I just want to know, is there a way of challenging the national budget on health? Because we get the private sector getting more or less the same money as the public sector, which serves 75% of the population, and whereas this same amount is being used for very few individuals who are really privileged. So is there a way of actually challenging that?
Right. I'm going to give very quick answers and then I'm going to run. But what I would say, I mean, I'm aware of that we could have had a much longer discussion. You are all welcome to come to our offices and have a session there sometime if it's possible to do it. And I can arrange other young lawyers who work with us and researchers, and we can have a very thorough discussion. Our offices are in Braamfontein, and really I mean that, and you're also welcome as individuals, because you people are the future of this country, and we would like to engage with you and persuade you on some of these issues. So, really, I mean, so just very quickly, the 4 questions. Question about how are patents used. You see, what a patent does is a patent gives the so-called inventor 20 years to have what's called market exclusivity, meaning that nobody else can produce and sell that product during the period of the patent. Now, that's fine if it's 20 years for a car maker. Nobody's going to die if you don't get a particular brand of car. But when it comes to a medicine, it's a different story, because what people do who have patents, it means that there's no competition. What competition does is that, you know, if Shari sells, we both make cars, but we both make equally good cars, but the car that she makes is 10,000 rand cheaper, then people will go and buy her car. And then I'm going to say, well, how can I go 5,000 rand cheaper than her? And so on and so on. Where there's no competition, you can set any price that you think the market can bear. Now, when it comes to medicines, you don't have a choice. So if I'm dying of AIDS and I need that medicine, then I will find a way to pay the price for that medicine, because I need it. I no longer say, is that actually what it really costs? I've got to get that medicine. And if I can't find the money, I die. And so that is the problem with patents on medicines. And that is what we've challenged. And part of our argument is that actually most of these pharmaceutical companies weren't even the inventors of the medicines. The medicines were researched and invented quite often in universities and so on. But that's a much longer question that I'm very happy to further discuss. The second question about the death rate. With HIV, if a person takes antiretroviral medicines and takes them properly, then a person will not die of HIV. Because the way antiretroviral medicines work is they don't cure you, they don't kill the virus, but they stop the virus from copying, from replicating in your body. And because they stop the virus from replicating in your body, then the virus is not able to attack the immune system, and it's the damage to the immune system that causes people to get tuberculosis and the illnesses that are caused by a weakened immune system. So antiretrovirals, not a cure, but they stop you from dying. So our mortality in this country has gone up from 48 back to 60 as a result of rolling out antiretrovirals. The problem is that many people who need antiretrovirals are not taking them still, because they're scared to admit that they have HIV, or to come forward for a test, or whatever it may be, or because the clinic is a bad clinic, or for whatever reason. So there's a lot of people in South Africa who are still dying because of HIV. In fact, about 180,000 people die a year of HIV. That's a hell of a lot. I mean, work that out on a daily basis. So that's several hundred people a day dying of HIV. And they're dying of a disease that's treatable and that's curable, not curable, that's preventable, and so on. So again, you know, we have to reach out to people. We need a government that goes and says to people, come, you know, you don't need to die. But again, a longer story. And then the last 2 questions. How risky is activism? You know, partly it depends on if we keep this democracy a strong democracy with the rights to freedom of expression, and we report every time somebody is intimidated, and we get protests when people are intimidated, and we show sympathy and support and so on to each other, then it's not dangerous. But if we allow our country to become like Angola or Zimbabwe or China, then it's dangerous. So at the moment, I wouldn't say it's not dangerous. You know, sometimes I'm fearful of my situation, and I hope I don't have to eat my words one day when I can't eat my words because somebody shot me. But but that's the way that we, the way that we look at it. And I would say to you, it's very rich activism. I've taken risks, but I've enjoyed every minute of it because it introduces you to people, the best people you'll ever meet in life. It makes you have to learn all of the time, new issues, new knowledge, and it's good to help people. So the benefits outweigh the risks. And then the last question, very, very good question, can we challenge the national budget? Yes, we can, in my view, challenge the national budget. It hasn't happened yet when it comes to health. In fact, I'm going to a meeting in Cape Town tomorrow morning with the Treasury to discuss the health budget and to say to them, look, you have a duty to the Constitution to make sure that healthcare services get better. There's two problems with the budget. One is not enough money in public health, and the second is, as you've correctly identified, the problem of private health, which eats up as much money as you said, well said, for 17% of the population as the public sector does for the other 83% of the population. They both spend about 150 billion rand per annum, but 150 billion is for 17% and one is for 83%. There are reasons for that, which when you come and meet with us at our office, we will happily expand upon. So thank you very much.
Before you go dash off, thank you so much for visiting us and sharing your knowledge. Your passion and excitement and commitment is palpable, and I think we all feel very energized and inspired. And all the best for this afternoon.
Thank you very much, and good luck, everybody. We depend on you all.